Jumping in for a second here, this is Jeff. If you could hold off, we had an issue with the interpreters. Gallaudet, I believe, has 2 interpreters here today. So we don't have any interpreters from CEASD because we had the Gallaudet interpreters. So if we can have the Gallaudet interpreters interpret, I hope that's okay. Sure. I just want to make sure that communication access is happening. Okay, so hopefully, yeah, we've got the interpreters on now. All right, I'll start again. I was just sharing a little bit about our annual Education and Advocacy Summit. There have been a number of schools involved with the Education Advocacy Summit over the last 5 or 6 years. The first day will be a visit to Gallaudet, a virtual visit. The second day we'll have a youth workshop. The third day will be an admin workshop hosted by the Clare Center. The fourth day is Hill Day, where you will be meeting with your selected officials. And as we've done before, we have all of our school members have the opportunity to participate. We have sent you the invitations. Hopefully register. Let us know if you're going to be able to make it. And it will be the week of February 22nd to 25th. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you for sharing, Barbara. As we approach the event, hopefully we have a good turnout online. Now I would like to introduce sponsors for this workshop. Bobby Cordano, who is the president of Gallaudet University. And at this point, I'll turn it over to President Cordano.
Hello there. Hello, Chris. Hello, everyone else. And thank you, Chris, for that introduction. It's nice to see Barbara and Jeff, all of you here. It's great to see everyone on camera. It's hard, though, to give a presentation when I can't see anyone's face. I recognize a few names here, and I did see Terry, but regardless, I wanted to say hello to everyone here at CEASD. Gallaudet is very pleased to be a sponsor of this conference. You know, we have staff members at the Clare Center who are engaged with CEASD and a part of this association, and we're very proud of that collaboration and that cooperative work. We are honored and always happy to be able to sponsor and support CEASD because I understand this is one of the most important forums for advancing the work that we do related to deaf education here in America. You all are a group of leaders that we recognize. We recognize that you're part of the collective support that we need to work together towards, because without it, we can't be successful. You are just, part of the national work that's being done. And without you, Gallaudet would not have the support it needs to do what we do. So we play a role in the CEASD system, as you do in our system. And we're all part of just an amazing educational ecosystem that has been built here in our country for a number of years. And our commitment at the university remains to you and to the work we've done thus far going forward, because we all know how much the children need us, the teachers need us, future administrators and educators of these children, they need us as well. So this collaboration between the university and CEASD is so very important. And I think it's important that we name that and remind ourselves of this important collaboration and why it's so important. My commitment as president of Gallaudet University is to continue to support learning throughout the lifespan for every person. I also recognize that Claire Bugan is somewhere here in our audience, and I wanted to recognize her as a member of our board of trustees. She always reminds me about her experiences in the K through 12 setting. And oh, there she is. Hello, Claire. Very good to see you. But with that, I just wanted to take a moment to recognize first the impact that COVID-19 has had on all of us. We have benefited from it in some ways. And I say that because all of us have had to learn different ways about how we work, about how we teach, how we collaborate and serve the needs of children and families as a result of this pandemic. And what's most important is that we together as a community of educators need to take time within the next 18 months to 2 years and really take a good look at some of the things that we've learned through this. What is it that we want to retain that related to the changes we had to make with virtual learning? And I use the word virtual learning very intentionally. I use a unique sign for virtual learning that shows that it's learning that used to be on the ground that now takes place in the cloud, because we are meeting in this digital space and no longer in a physical space do we meet and interact with one another. COVID has forced us to really look at different ways in which we can meet different virtual needs as opposed to face-to-face gatherings. And I know for all of you, some of you are already back and doing that in-person teaching, whereas others made attempts to come back and maybe had to revert back to the virtual learning environment, or have gone back and forth between the two, face-to-face and virtual learning. I believe in the future, our children have been able to show us some tolerance and some flexibility around their capability of doing both, being engaged in a virtual environment and also on a face-to-face environment. As I understand, we've always thought that children can't do certain things, and it's important that we examine that word can't. What are the criteria and the characteristics that would make it impossible? So if we could identify those things more easily to see what's not conducive to certain kinds of education, and then adapt our learning and our educating so that we're ready for the next pandemic. And, you know, I have to say, this is just the beginning of our learning about how to cope with a pandemic. What I hear now is that there's a bigger pandemic yet to come down the road at some point in time. So this is learning that we're going to need and process together, figuring out how we can better prepare ourselves for whatever may lie ahead in the future. And it's not so much just about the pandemic. I also understand it's also about providing our children with educational options. Educational options that would be most conducive to their success. We know that there are different characteristics that are associated with different paths of learning. So that's one piece that I wanted to share. The second piece to this comes to this same notion, but with a different lens. What have we learned about bilingual learning in this environment and the use of the virtual space to do so? And how does that differ from face-to-face environments? Many people thought in the past that people who are deaf learn visually, and so virtual learning would not be conducive to sign language users. And we know that's simply not true. Our children, both young and old, and even our college students have shown us that they in fact are very capable of doing this. And we're seeing sign language vibrancy happening in the cloud virtually, as it might even sometimes face-to-face. So it can happen in both environments. And I'm thinking it's what's most powerful about this. I told this one story recently where I came to realize that deaf people have throughout the ages been seeking to find ways that they might overcome the costs of the physical separation that we've experienced from our peers who sign. One of the earliest inventions was the TTY. And while it was kind of that clunky old machine where we had to communicate in English, it allowed us to stay connected to people who are geographically separate from us and continue to retain that deaf experience through those technologies. So I'm wondering how it is that, we did this virtual learning environment because of the fact we've had this experience having used other technologies, VRI and FaceTime. There are many deaf people who are early adapters, in fact, of FaceTime and other technologies. And there are all kinds of apps now available to people to be able to do that kind of virtual communication. I'm reminded of how successful we've been in this area. I have an opportunity to meet with other colleges, universities, professors, and it was the presidents rather. And it was the funniest thing because, I know how to adapt your screen to make sure that you're visually accessible to others watching, where the other presidents were barely able to operate their screens and their cameras so that they could capture their face, and they didn't know how to use the technologies effectively visually. So they didn't understand how to really present themselves in this kind of a visual environment. Well, we've had all kinds of training through the use of video phones with interpreters not being able to see our signing. So we position ourselves in certain ways and make our clothing so it's contrasting to our environments. We have years and years of experience to draw from that's prepared us in some ways. But even with that preparation, I don't think it led us to really accept the user visual environment as an environment that can be conducive to learning. Well, that certainly has changed now. I think even just this meeting happening in Zoom, I think we're on Zoom, right? That is the platform. But even just this meeting happening on Zoom reminds me of that. And I can't get over the fact that I'm only seeing one live face, whereas there are many people who are watching in. And I can see that just based on the names here in the chat. But I think I have to remember here that I'm talking with Barbara and Claire and Karen and all the other names that I see here in the participant list, even though I'm not seeing their faces. So that's a new learning, a new experience for us. What does this mean for our future of bilingual learning, and how can we incorporate some of our experiences as deaf signing people, using as well the technology and video technologies to enhance our learning? There's a number of research opportunities here. Educational practices and written discussion groups can be happening in all sorts of places around this topic. I wanted to end my comments here with sharing a little bit of my heart with all of you. And this ties into the work that you do and understanding your experience, what you're doing around the idea of the post-traumatic growth understanding. And sometimes for many deaf people, we know the trauma we experience and the triggers that result from it. It's almost like PTSD. Those triggers don't ever stop because we've once been traumatized. Once that trauma happens, it very often creates residual traumas as a result that then are often labeled PTSD. We know there are a number of deaf children who have that and a number of deaf adults who have that as well. I can see with the different domains that you're working on, acknowledging the capacity to develop deeper relationships, the openness to new possibilities, the domain of having that greater sense of personal strength that you have, the other domain of just that stronger sense of self and spirituality, and the last, a greater appreciation of life. I am heartened by your attention to these areas, in particular that third area of work that focuses on the mind and the spiritual experience and the physical experience. And that holds true for not just the teachers, the students, but also the teachers and the administrators. It's the work that our entire community need to do together. You're leading our way. You are developing the expertise and the knowledge and the training that all of us will benefit from in the years ahead. Personally speaking, I just have to share with you that I can see on a daily basis evidence of this. I can see how the deaf community is always feeling as though they're lagging behind when it comes to access to knowledge in the greater community that people who can hear have as it relates to this particular topic. So I am so excited to see you're catching everybody up. You're making up for any lost ground that may have happened previously to make sure we're up to speed. And you can decide changes that will affect all of us and change us as well. So thank you for your leadership, for your vision, and really looking to the heart of the work, the spiritual connections that we have with our students, with teachers, to really make sure that we're able to live this life together such that we all realize the value that we hold as deaf people, as human beings, all as members of this planet. And we have so much to offer the world. The work that you do combines the heart, the spirit, and the mind in such a way that it shows the beauty of the value we have to offer to the world at large. So thank you for inviting me here today. I appreciate the time I've had with you, and I wish you all the best of luck.
Thank you, President Cordano, for today's remarks. I'll make sure to be aware of the multi-layers that are here and thinking about learning as well as exploring the various options that we have. We certainly appreciate your ongoing support of CEASD. Thank you so
Thank you.
much to Gallaudet University.
Thanks, everyone.
Great. At this point, I would like to introduce our presenter, Dr. Elizabeth Moore. Dr. Moore is the Interim Chief Diversity Officer, or CDO, at Gallaudet University. She's worked in the Department of Social Work within Gallaudet University for 24 years and has also pursued her master's in social work at Gallaudet. And that took place over 12 years and eventually became the chair. Dr. Moore grew up in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, went to oral school, and afterwards went to PSD, where Liz was able to acquire ASL. And after graduating with high honors, she went to attend Gallaudet University, got her degree in social work, and then again pursued her master's degree, MSW, and then completed her PhD in special education administration in 2011. At this point, I would like to introduce Dr. Elizabeth Moore to the floor. And her presentation is focused on bias and bias interruption. Elizabeth, the floor is yours. Thank you for the warm introduction, Chris. Thank you so much. If you wouldn't mind advancing to the next slide. I'm sure many of you have thought about interrupting your bias, and really it's everyone's bias that needs to be interrupted. We can see how complex and layered that the world is. The trauma that we've seen has taken place throughout decades and centuries. Many people in the United States have experienced discrimination from racism or other forms of oppression and discrimination at a level that is 24/7 nonstop. There have been many conflicts that have taken place, especially in the culturally diverse communities. It's been quite heavy. And it is now time for us to go about our self-analysis, review how it is that we unpack our thoughts, how we engage with other people, the way that we behave towards other people. There are times where we might have conversation that's casual and it actually causes harm to others without our realization. Perhaps unintentional, and in some cases, perhaps done on purpose. Again, we are all human beings. We are all individual people who are dealing with a number of different things. So it's critical for us to learn and understand what it means to have bias, to understand that your upbringing has shaped your values. It's especially important because we work with people every single day. So I'm here to provide a training on interrupting your bias. And I have to share that this topic is sensitive and it might be triggering for some of you. You will think about what you may have done to others in the past. I suggest that you try to be open-minded, try to have an open heart and a willingness to learn so that we may become more aware of what we're actually doing towards other people. Next. Allow me to explain individual bias as well as interactional bias. So the word bias, also known as implicit bias, refers to attitudes or stereotypes that may take place even without you being conscious of them, without your own awareness or control. And these thoughts impact your understanding, your actions, and your decisions. There are times where you may be led by some of those implicit biases to make the wrong decisions. Why do we have unconscious bias? And this is the way that I'll sign that. Many of us have grown up constantly gathering information through visual means in realms such as education, media, the news, commercials, emails, constantly being bombarded with information. Our families also teach us values, or we witness the ways that they behave. There are certain role models that we have that we aspire to be like, and as such, replicate their behavior. And even thinking more broadly in society, the different incidental learning and information that is given to you. Your brain goes through this process of categorizing these sources of information, things, people, etc. There's a lot going on in your brain when processing that information. And there are millions of pieces of information that are being processed every second. And that's what ultimately can lead to some misinformation or having stereotypes or resulting in making poor decisions. These are some of the things that can happen. Allow me to share with you some examples. One example is a likability bias. This is something that you may witness, especially in the workplace. When someone sees women as easy to get along with and likable versus other employees who may appear to be less friendly, there's already a bias or a judgment that's taken place internally, despite the fact that you don't know that person well. You're simply judging based on what you see from their appearance. That's one example of a likability bias. Another example is an attribution bias. We give diverse and underrepresented groups, just such as Latinx, LGBTQ, Black communities, etc., these different identity groups, individuals that are deafblind. That's another example. What happens is we typically give them less credit. We notice that in group meetings where there seems to be very intense conversations, and there's a person who's given an opportunity to share their perspective, and they may come from a diverse background, and what they have to share isn't as heavily weighed as someone who maybe shares the same background as the moderator. For example, coming from a deaf family, and instantly we can see that there's attribution bias there, but the person that doesn't connect to the facilitator maybe doesn't get that same level of credit, or not allowed for their perspective on certain issues to be understood. So these are the things that have happened. And because we have people who come from varying backgrounds, experiencing different levels of credit, That's what we refer to as attribution bias. There's also performance bias. Often people of color share that their experience is such that they have to work doubly, triply hard in order to prove their worth, despite they might have the same assignments or job duties as their work counterparts. People of color aren't recognized for what they provide. It's often shared that the expertise and knowledge is not recognized because they are a person of color. And that's something that's actually true. There have been countless stories from many, many people of color in the workplace who have shared those feelings. That's what we call performance bias. We also have affinity bias. Affinity bias refers to a group of people who share the same background as another group of people. So I'll give you an example. For CEASD, you can think of, for example, mainstream schools, schools for the deaf. There are some deaf people that grow up in a hearing mainstream public school environment and don't learn sign language until they get to college. And it's at that point that they begin learning. And what we've noticed when we have these various groups, where we have one group who may have a lot of deaf family members and come from generational deaf families that grew up with sign language, compared with another deaf person who is in a mainstream environment, or perhaps came from a hearing family where they were the only deaf member. We notice there are these kind of groups taking place, which can be witnessed at conferences or even places to eat, like at cafeteria. There are affinity groups that are based on similar backgrounds. And I'm pretty sure that's something that each of you have noticed um, yourselves. Another example is maternal bias. Often parents are judged as, and especially when it comes to the mother, because the mother is the person who spends the most time with the children. And often it's the case where people may perceive that as um, an opportunity to judge the mom and whether or not the mom is good or not good. But we don't often talk about the dad. The father figure is generally seen in a more positive light. Hard worker, doing their best to support their family, and the father seems to show commitment. They commit to spending time with their children. But again, if we look at the number of hours that a father might spend with his child, people don't think about that. And they often judge the mother more than they would the father. And this is actually something that's shown by research, which is quite interesting. Another example of bias is intersectionality. For individuals that have more than one identity, especially in the deaf community, they may be deaf and blind, or Latino and deaf, and a woman, might be black, deaf, lesbian, indigenous, hard of hearing, gay. Those with more than one identity often experience multiplicative, issues with those that maybe are white and deaf. If it's a deaf compared to a deaf person of color, the deaf person of color will typically face more oppression than the white deaf person. And again, a multitude of forms of discrimination, exponentially more, that is witnessed by the person of color compared to a non-diverse person. There's a discrepancy that's been noticed, as well as a stereotype that could be applied to a person of color, which worsens the experience of the person of color compared to the white person. So I mentioned interactional bias, which can also be known as microaggressions. Microaggression can mean a person picking on someone else through certain messages or remarks that are made, or visible, responses towards someone else, or some type of actual discrimination against members of another group, members of a marginalized group who experience these microaggressions can also be known as the interactional biases. And this is something that can be done intentionally at an individual level. And I'm happy to share with you an example of microaggression. If we can move on to the next slide, please. Now, we've gone about collecting all these examples from actual experiences that people have had of experiencing microaggressions. So I'll share some examples. In this case, we have a Black person or African American person who said that they're sick of people saying, wow, you are really smart. You don't sign like other Black deaf people. You sign really intelligently. Now, that person felt incredibly hurt. When you talk about those other people, you're forgetting that these other Black deaf people could be their siblings or relatives, and that's extremely offensive. That's one example of a microaggression that could be unintentional. Here's another example. There's an Asian Pacific American who said that they often see this stereotype. When I look at you, it's hard to tell what you are because you all look the same. Like, I know this one person who's Asian, but there are also 34 different Asian countries. So it's so hard. But, I know my colleagues that I see every day, I'm able to know what their identities are ethnically, but it's hard to figure that out when I look at you. That's another example. Here's an example from a Middle Eastern North African person. And this is something they see very often, the three B's. And this is referring to Arabs being seen as billionaires or bombers or belly dancers. That's the stereotype that some people have characterized Arab people as, and that's completely false. Through these examples, we see these stereotypes are making crude assumptions. There was a person who was Latino and shared their experience of others being fascinated at how strong their English skills are. And then that causes confusion because the person who experiences this microaggression grew up here in America. And to know that there's people who see them and automatically assume that their English is poor is also quite offensive. Here are some other examples. This is something that can be seen in school quite often. You've got new students that are coming in, and the teacher's assistant is someone that the students seek out as opposed to the actual teacher. Because the teacher is a person of color, they're not getting the attention from their students that their teacher's assistant, which is subordinate to them, is getting. Now, this is probably unintentional. It's not likely that this is done on purpose, but it's interesting how it shows subconsciously your brain function can lead to your ultimate behavior. It's quite interesting. Now, I'm sure many of you have gone through similar experiences of when people are trying to use spoken English and you tell them that you're deaf, and their reaction is so shocked. And they ask if you can read. As a deaf person, I can't stand that. I've approached hearing people many times only to get that response. And I know that many of you have gone through these experiences. This could be an example of where someone might not even be aware of their microaggression. Another example is you may have noticed when in a meeting, there might be a discussion happening, and the veteran employees might say something like, "Oh, you're new here. I've been here a long time. Let me show you the ropes." And then the newer person's input is disregarded, despite the fact that their input can have value and different perspective. They're not regarded as seriously because they're new. That's an experience that many have gone through. Now, when we consider the academic setting or the workplace, this is especially where we see this. And there's a lot of research that's been done in those areas. In the research that's being done, following protocol and guidelines, the researcher is still questioned. And it's not fair because the experience that they get is different in terms of being questioned compared to their colleagues who have done similar research. And peer reviews of research are those that are questioned more intensely. And it's strikingly obvious that the question is it because I'm a person of color? Black ASL is a topic that's often questioned as far as whether or not Black ASL is an actual language. It's been challenged a number of times historically, and that's just one example. Next slide.
A few more examples. And an example here for people of color in the US that is frequently heard and very frustrating is, where are you from, or where are you really from? And if the person answers, well, I'm from here in this state in the US, it's still questioned. The question is, where are you really from? And that's offensive. That question is unnecessary. Why do you need to know? And why? I mean, look at yourselves. Would you ask that question to yourselves or to another white person? If you were with a group of friends and you were talking about your culture and your experiences, maybe at that point it would be an appropriate time to talk about where your family is from or the types of food or clothes or customs you have, certainly. But if you're at school or at work and you raise that question at an inappropriate time, that's likely unnecessary and sometimes make people question what you're asking, and it makes people feel unwelcome. The next example, and I've heard this story as well, is where a faculty member has worked for a number of years at an institution, say 5 years, contributed to their department, but the larger campus community may not acknowledge them or think that they know everyone and everyone knows them, but then they're still seen as new even when that person has been there for a long period of time. They're not seen as part of the community. They're more easily overlooked. And that's important. That's makes that person feel like their contributions are not significant, and that when they do contribute, when they do work, that it's not being recognized. And again, it's feeling not welcome, not belonging. The next example, and that quote we see there around Indigenous people, is something that is seen often and often shared by Indigenous people, where the belief is that the identity of Indigenous people is unimportant and that discussion should be pushed aside. But Indigenous people are absolutely part of this community, and that identity is important. We absolutely have Indigenous deaf people all over the country. And often that identity, those people feel excluded, like their identity isn't valued, like their contribution is unimportant. And it's frustrating it causes extreme anger because they are absolutely a part of this community. Lastly, the saying, I don't see color, or I don't see race. People are people. Race is unimportant. The phrase that we hear is colorblind. Saying that you're colorblind is a form of racism. It's important to know that. It means that you refuse to recognize people having diverse backgrounds. That is racism. All right, next slide. Now I'd like to talk about Kim Scott's radical candor. These are 4 different concepts. There's showing care and personality versus challenging someone, choosing to be involved or not involved. And being uninvolved and staying silent is an example of being a bystander. And saying that you're not going to be part of the issue. And if you think that if you just stand by, you're not part of the problem, that's not true. By trying to say you are not part of the issue and not engaging with it makes you part of the problem. And it actually makes the situation worse. There is no neutral. If you witness something happening to a person of color and you leave and you've seen that situation happen where you could have positively contributed and lent support to that person of color who needed that support or that help in, for example, reporting an incident, that is an issue. And let me talk about these 4 different concepts here. First, let's start with the upper left-hand corner. And that says ignorance, no change. And this is a person who stands by and tries to avoid harm or demeaning anyone and avoids engaging in any type of conflict, which means they're showing no empathy. That's why it's called ruinous empathy. It's selfish. That's what I would call it. It's an unwillingness to be part of the situation. It's an unwillingness to lend support, to make an effort, to make people feel valuable. On the lower left-hand side, we see mistrust, no change. And people in this group stay in groups of people that have the same background, stay only in their affinity group. One example of that would be staying and spending time only with deaf people who grew up in deaf schools and from deaf families, the deaf elite, who only connect with others who have a shared deaf history. And that's manipulative insincerity. It's an unwillingness to interact with a number of different groups and people who are different from oneself. And when this group in question causes any problems, they become defensive and are unwilling to help anyone else. The lower right-hand corner is defensiveness with little change. The characteristics of people in this group are people who share their opinion without any constraint, who will mock others, who will mock those who are different from them or who disagree with them, and completely dismiss those who do not share their beliefs and values. These are people who believe that they are right all the time and others are wrong, and are incredibly racist and discriminatory. These people are divisive and cruel to others. There is no trust with these people. And it's an utter lack of willingness to engage with others due to arrogance and viewing themselves as superior to others. The upper right-hand corner is trust and fundamental change. And that's about those people who are willing and motivated to acknowledge their mistakes, to recognize their part that they play in comments and microaggressions, and in learning how to adapt one's behavior. Maybe by sitting down and having a brave conversation to resolve an issue. And these are people who are willing to learn about others' cultures, to engage with others, and try to develop a collaborative relationship with people different from themselves. And that's what's called radical candor. It's about respect and a willingness to take risks in order to have a better understanding of one's bias, and to deliver themselves and to share information about themselves, to recognize the positive and the negative, to show empathy and to show care. So that's what we see in the upper right hand corner. Let's go to the next slide. I would like to start with the second column, which is a growth mindset. It ties to what I just described before and those characteristics of radical candor. The characteristics of radical candor align very well with a growth mindset. It's about being courageous, to be willing to listen to others, to observe others, to engage, and to support as needed. And to acknowledge that as a human being, I will make mistakes, but also to acknowledge that I can do something about the mistakes that I made. No doubt. It's about a willingness to learn from my mistakes. So those with the growth mindset will say that if something happens, that they will own it, that they will be part of the solution, that they will own their part and responsibility in the issue that occurs. They also recognize that these issues are human rights issues. For example, Black Lives Matter. That's something that people would willingly learn about in a growth mindset, learn about the experience, engage, and understand how they can best provide support, and are interested in making the time and effort to learn and to grow. That is an example of a growth mindset. Now, if we go over to the first column, that describes a fixed mindset. And a fixed mindset is when someone will say something like, well, I don't know where to start or what to say, so I'm just not going to get involved. Or I'm worried if I say something wrong, I'm going to get called out and criticized, and I can't handle that, so I'm not going to try. In that situation, we have to think about, how does one grow if one doesn't acknowledge their mistakes? Of course, all of us will learn from our mistakes. We're going to make more of them, and we can grow from them. It's important to be open and recognize that none of us are perfect, but we all can learn from what we've done and make changes for the better. People with a fixed mindset refuse to be part of the solution and work to make changes. Even when they do begin to learn a lesson, they don't want to be involved in what they call politics and say they don't have the time. And they're more likely the people who are the problem. Let's move on to the next slide. Acknowledgement is important, as well as validation. And I'll talk about what is meant by acknowledgement and validation on the next slide. Acknowledgement is about having one person share something, and you or the person listening to first acknowledge what that person has said. It's about acknowledging what a person has said, listening to them, processing what they've said. And when a person says something, it can be misunderstood or lead to the wrong conclusion. So it's important when you're in a conversation to ask something like, did you mean, and repeat what was said. Use words or phrases that you understand the person to mean. And repeat back to the person what they said from what you understand. Checking in that way will minimize those misunderstandings and potential conflict. Reflecting what that other person says, mirroring, paraphrasing. When you do that, when you're able to reflect that back to the person, that minimizes those issues. That is what I mean by acknowledgement. It's showing that you care about the person, what they're saying, and you're attentive to them. Then validation. That's about acknowledging the other person's emotions, their emotional state, where they're at, and engaging with them to show that you've got a sense of their feelings and validating what they're sharing, which does not mean judging and does not mean assuming or agreeing either. Don't try to jump to fixing something or to a conclusion. It's just about acknowledging what a person feels. For example, by saying, oh, okay, I understand that. Saying, oh, it seems you feel this way. Again, doing the reflecting and mirroring, paraphrasing, or describing what you see, them feeling hurt or angry. Saying something like, I don't blame you for feeling that way. Do your best to incorporate what they've said and describe what they have shared about their experience and their emotions. Do that as opposed to saying, well, oh, that's just terrible. Oh, that's so bad. Using the signs that I use or those words show judgment, and people may be taken aback by that and may choose to withdraw and not continue having a conversation with you. So try to be sensitive and show that you're listening. And if you don't understand what someone's saying or what they mean, ask them to clarify. Even say something like, to clarify, I believe you said that. Or I think I know how you feel. Or to ask those questions, and don't let yourself get stuck in your own thoughts and trying to figure out what a person has meant. It's much better to ask questions and will avoid future problems, any complications that are there. Point is, we are people and we're not mind readers. So it's important to engage in dialogue with someone about what they're saying to better understand it. Now, how can we analyze our own biases? How do we understand our bias? How do we look at what our family has taught us and what our beliefs are? We can do our homework and maybe putting a list on paper of what our parents have taught us, what we believe, about what we thought about what happened on January 6th with what happened on Capitol Hill, or what happened on September 11th, watching the planes fly into those buildings. It might help you to better understand yourself, but I would also advise you to take an implicit bias test. There's specifically implicit association tests available, IATs. Harvard has created these, and they look at bias. I have taken a number of them, and I thought I knew myself well. And in some of the results that I received, I was shocked. I was shocked to see that. And so I tried to take it again, and I got the same results. Took the same test and got the same result. And that was eye-opening to me, to realize that that was my perception. And I thought that was really interesting. It doesn't necessarily mean that I'm a bad person, that I have this bias. It was something for me to learn about myself. It's good to learn about what my biases are and what I can do. I have to educate myself, read, go to workshops, go to conferences, engage in dialogue with members of different cultural groups than my own to learn more about them. And at the same time, I have to admit the mistakes that I've made and acknowledge what I've done and work very hard not to repeat those same mistakes or continue on with that same behavior or jumping to conclusions. It's important to not make a habit of jumping to conclusions. It's important to do your research to better understand, for example, your students or the others in your situation. And at the same time, it's important to read about the experiences of people from different backgrounds to understand the oppression and discrimination that they've faced, to be able to modify your own behavior accordingly. It's important to gain a better understanding and to adopt a growth mindset. That will help considerably in lessening those conflicts and making sure that your relationships with people from diverse backgrounds are improved. And like I just said, it's very important to listen to the experiences of underrepresented groups, to acknowledge when you make a mistake, admit it, and address it. Don't just leave it to fester. Ask questions. Be curious. Maybe you engage in a conversation with someone and you jump to tell a person that they're wrong. You do it in a harsh way. Take a moment instead and think about that. Think about what the other person is saying and realize they're offering a different perspective. Just be curious. Ask questions when someone shares a perspective that challenges yours. Ask the person what makes them think that. I mean, what makes you think you are right? What makes anyone think they're right? And being right or wrong, I mean, there are times where people simply have different perspectives. And that requires all of us at times to make compromises when it comes to decisions, potentially. It's important to be brave, to challenge statements that seem biased, to address them when they happen. Please be brave when those comments are made. Challenge those comments, but do it in a gentle way. If you come through to the other person very harshly, it is very likely they will be defensive and not cooperate with you or connect with you. So it's important to address them in a gentle and friendly way and show that you're genuinely curious about what the person said and ask them to share more about why they think or believe what they do. Have that conversation. Mentoring, sponsoring, or being an ally is important. An ally is an opposite of a bystander. It's someone who actively engages. The A in ally stands for act, and the L's are for learning and listening. And not jumping in and sharing your opinion and showing that you believe it's best. It's about learning and listening to others. Let's move to the next slide. This scale is very interesting. racism scale is not fixed in that you are certainly racist depending on where you are here. It's about giving you more of an idea of where you're at a given time. And if that's not a place that you want to stay, you want to keep moving along the scale, moving forward to work toward allyship. So let's look through each of these terms and the characteristics and see which ones you feel align with you. And if there's one that does seem to align with you and you don't want that to be true, think about the characteristics that you have. Think about the ways that you can educate yourself and engage with others in order to change how you act and interact with the world and get to the place that you want to be. You want to get to a point where being able to be an ally, but you cannot call yourself an ally. And people who call themselves allies, who are not engaged in the community, who are not visiting the community, who are not discussing with learning the culture of, if they call themselves an ally to the community, it doesn't just mean being sweet and saying hello. Being an ally is not just about sitting with another person once in a while. To be an ally requires understanding of others' cultures and not just being a supporter. So this racism scale helps you to get a better sense of where you are and where you can improve and work toward allyship. The goal is always to continue working along this scale to reach the point of allyship, to reach the point that other people see your solidarity, your engagement, and see your involvement with the NBDA, with the National Black Deaf Advocates, to see your involvement with making things easier for Black deaf people, to see your involvement with changing the system to where all deaf people of color have access to resources that they need easily and barrier free. And the people who get to that point are very much appreciated by the community and are valued for that work and are called, the people who do that work are called allies by others. Describing yourself as an ally is very different than having others describe you as an ally.
Now, when something happens in that meeting that you're a part of, and you may notice a person who's sharing negative comments about Muslims, and you witness it, you may feel uneasy initially about what to do with that situation. So I wanted to share with you some ideas on how to address unpleasant situations in order to give you all a better idea as to how you can engage or deal with these difficult situations that may feel awkward. Next slide. So if there's anything you observe, for example, like the example I just shared, where someone's sharing some disparaging remarks or derogatory comments, you could ask, what makes you use that phrase? What is it about that group that makes you use that word? If you don't mind, what do you know about that group? And the goal here is to really open up with a soft conversation. If it appears that they don't know much about whatever group they're talking about, then you could perhaps offer to learn or research without putting that person down. So you become a part of the situation without necessarily demeaning that person or telling them what to do or whatever you think is best. I think working alongside that person and allowing them to learn about Muslims with the hope that they'll learn something that they didn't know about that group. The goal is to try to figure, the situation out without, speaking down to them or trying to tell them what to do. It's really about how you can work with them in a soft approach. Someone being stereotyped is an example that you may see. Someone being stereotyped as an angry Black woman or Black man, someone who's on stage giving a very, um, visible kind of monologue or a very passionate monologue can be seen as anger. Whereas if a white man can be on the same stage giving the same presentation, the white man's presentation would be seen as inspirational. Whereas if it was a Black woman who was giving the same exact presentation, it would be seen as her behaving in a bold manner or even a mean manner. It's very interesting how the audience can perceive these two messages differently. And the reason for that is there has been a number of years in which Black women never had that level of opportunity. And it's something that's different. It's a new face. So when we look at our current, Vice President of the United States, the first woman, first Black woman, first Asian American as Vice President, is she widely accepted by those in the country? That's a question we need to wonder. There could be some that take offense to seeing a woman like her in that role. And that goes to the concept of white privilege, where Black people are not seen as individuals who are suited to be in, executive administrative positions. That, there's a perception that those spaces are for white people. So those are examples of stereotypes that individuals may carry. There are times where I get interesting comments whenever there's a conversation happening and a disagreement comes up. I bring a different perspective, and the person I'm speaking to may feel threatened and suddenly change their whole demeanor. That leads to confusion for me because I always thought that it was okay to disagree. And I simply just offered a different perspective. I've been called names, I've been threatened, I've been called mean, I've been called too loud. There have been many different experiences that are similar to the ones that I had, which have been experienced by other people. So our next slide. So especially in cases where, like I just described, you might be in a meeting and one of your colleagues, has an idea, raises their hand and starts sharing what idea they have. And then another colleague, tries to raise their hand and share their idea. And when they do, the person facilitating says yes and gives them positive feedback and affirms that person who was second. Meanwhile, the person who said that same idea first doesn't get the same credit. And often the first person who shares the idea, if they're a person of color, they don't get that same level of credit or praise as opposed to if it's, a white person sharing the same message. If that happens, you can say, hey, it seems like this person said the same thing that person A said. And you want to make sure that people are acknowledged, that the first person to share that, comment or idea doesn't go unnoticed. These are things that you as an ally in the meeting space can do, and actively support. If you notice that two people shared the same idea and one person the second person to share the same idea got credit, but the first person didn't, think about how you can interrupt that kind of microaggression. And that's one example. Oftentimes when you share something, people may experience hurt. and it's not intentional, but that happens and it's okay. Again, oftentimes our actions are ultimately led by our subconscious or biases that we're not even aware of. And there are times where things we say could be hurtful to someone else. If you were, to witness a conversation between two people and you can see how someone was hurt by something the other person said, perhaps you can step in and say, hey, maybe you can explain that, you felt hurt, but this person didn't offer to rephrase what they were trying to say. Perhaps if you rephrase it or say it in a different way, that allows the communication to be much clearer and lessens the conflict. So this example really requires effort and time, but the ultimate goal is to resolve communication conflicts between two parties. And depending on the situation, it might determine if I get involved or not. If the person that caused harm just said, sorry, that's it, then I might intervene and say, hey, maybe it would be best to rephrase what you tried to say or say it in a way that can help the two of you come to a resolution. There are times where you notice policies or handbooks that appear to be biased. If you do see that, please speak up. You may not think that the situation applies to you directly, but if you can think of others who would be directly impacted by this policy, you need to speak up. I can tell you that your colleagues would appreciate your support, your willingness to bring things forward. By speaking up, it might allow the policy to be revisited and certain changes to be made. An example I can share with you is Zoom. We use it for our meetings, but there are times where individuals who are deafblind or a person who has visual challenges require a spotlight. It's often the case when we're engaged in a very deep discussion, we forget to spotlight. There are times where people are waving their hand to get attention to remind us to spotlight, but they go ignored. And we forget about the people who may have visual challenges. We should develop a policy on how communication happens and spotlighting happens. There's also times where it's unclear as to who's being spoken to on Zoom. So it would be a good idea for there to be a policy in which everyone could allow for fair opportunity to participate, especially with those that have visual challenges or who are deafblind, and ensure that the policy is allowing effective access for everyone involved. Another example I've seen is, for a person using the word ghetto, and that's something that uh, is very sensitive. You should seek to use neutral words. I mean, despite you perhaps knowing someone from an early age or being childhood friends, you never know what people are going through. It's difficult to see what people are dealing with on a daily basis and the different things that they have to endure and experience, the levels of oppression. So when you say words like that, the recipient might just accept it and not speak out against it. And the reason for that is they might not have enough support. The experiences that they've gone through where the system put them down and oppressed them and didn't allow them to feel like they had support, even from family. Because you have to remember, most of these students are coming from hearing families. They might have some level of support. It might not be substantial, but it's your job to understand where it is that they're coming from. And that also includes your own colleagues. Next. So I explained this one already, If you're ever feeling hurt, anger, or disrespected, you should speak out and communicate. There might be times where someone needs an advocate who can tell them that it's okay for them to share their thoughts or feelings without fear of penalty. Because oftentimes people are scared that if they say something, then they may face retaliation in some way, shape, or form. So we really want to set up a culture or environment where people feel comfortable to open up and have honest conversations. If there's ever misunderstandings, try your best not to assume and allow for it to be clarified. And again, of course, this takes time and effort, but the ultimate goal is to resolve the communication conflict or misunderstanding. Next slide. If there seems to be a difficult or um, a situation that appears to have some tension and it's difficult to come to agreement, it's always possible to put a pause to that contentious situation and reflect on what's actually causing that discomfort. All of us have homework to do, and we're tasked with listening to other people's perspective in hopes of reducing or mitigating that potential tension or misunderstanding. Communication can be complicated, so make sure you put together the time and effort anytime possible. Put a pause to the disagreement or conversation and do your work. Or reflect on what you're expressing, how you contributed to that misunderstanding or disagreement, and anyone who's involved should also do the same. And again, the goal is to come to a resolution. It might be the case that there's a level of compromise that has to happen, but the goal is to resolve the conflicts. Next, please. So if there's ever a moment where you get called out for microaggression, it can certainly be a very strong and blunt kind of feedback. Try your best to make that other person feel heard, feel acknowledged. Have that acknowledgement of whatever it is that they shared with you. Validate their emotions. Apologize for what it is that you may have said or the behavior that you did, which caused that person to feel the way they feel. Do not, look to make excuses and try to deflect and try to over explain yourself. Just be honest, and a one time apology is enough. Engage with them and try to see from their point of view. What you want to avoid is making them appear to be responsible for the problem. You really want to own your part. And in that moment, it requires you to be humble. It requires you to be willing to create a solution. Next. Next slide, please. So this is a list of don'ts. So if you're called out, you want to make sure that you do not give that person who called you out the responsibility for your behavior. You want to communicate in a way that lets you process and manage lets you process what they're trying to say. So don't put the burden on them. Don't expect them to help manage your feelings. It's not their responsibility. You know, the ultimate truth is that we're flawed. We make mistakes. We all have good intentions. There are just times where we lead to conflict, but that's okay because we're human. We just need to recognize and acknowledge whenever we make mistakes, be aware of it, fix it, and be accountable. Own that part. Don't just say, oh, that's something I do often. That's just the way I am. You really want to thank them for giving you that feedback instead of talking about yourself. This is a conversation between you and the other person. And the goal is to change in a way that you can reach a solution. As I said earlier, try not to over explain or overdo your apology by laying on your guilt. Don't make it a scene. Try not to be too dramatic. You really want to just be calm and simple and short, and having that conversation where you recognize the mistakes you made. Okay, next.
Additional considerations for difficult conversations are just recognizing that it's not easy, that we live in a complicated world and we all come from a variety of backgrounds. And yes, mistakes happen. Communication issues can happen. What's important is to be mindful of your own biases, educate yourself about other cultures, and pay attention to how you express yourself to others, and pay attention to your behaviors and the words that you use. Use more neutral language when possible and avoid you statements. Instead, use I statements. Talk about what you think or what it seems to you instead of pointing the finger figuratively and literally at others. Also, recognize that in conversation, it's not just about your own perspective, it's about the other person's or people's perspective as well. It's important to recognize that there can be two different perspectives on the same thing. So don't assume that your way of seeing things is more accurate and that the other person's way of seeing something is wrong. Two people share different perspectives. Be compassionate as well, and try to avoid, again, belaboring the point or by saying, oh, this is so difficult for me, because the other person doesn't need to hear that. When they've called you out on something, considering all that they've been through, and then they don't need to hear that. They also don't need you to say over and over again, you feel so bad or so terrible. Being dramatic actually doesn't help. And it means you're playing the victim, and you can't play the victim in this. You need to own it. Next. There are points where you need to try to meet a person halfway. And if you vehemently disagree and you see a major conflict happen, just acknowledge that. Acknowledge that the other person's offering a different perspective than what you have. And you can ask that person to share more about why they think what they do. Try and share your perspective and engage in dialogue. Don't just put something out there and say, this is what you should do to change. Don't give unsolicited advice. If you're asked for advice, that's one thing, but otherwise, only give it if it's explicitly asked for. Doing that can actually lead to further conflict and further problems. And when that happens, if it does, then it may be important to stop the meeting. If you've reached that impasse, then you may need to reschedule the meeting and have it later to clarify the misunderstanding. Let's move on to the next slide. Again, remember that all of us in our environments where we work and learn every day have biases. At the same time, it's important that we work to support other people in avoiding microaggressions, in addressing bias, in having difficult conversations, with the goal of promoting a warm and welcoming environment, a warm and welcoming community at your schools, at your workplaces. We are all responsible for that. And with that in mind, we have to try to avoid placing that education about all of these things on diverse people. Avoid making them the people who have to teach and have the answer to every question. We are all responsible for this, for creating a better culture and a better environment. And we all share the responsibility of educating each other about various cultures. So if I don't know about a certain culture, I can't be responsible for that until I do my homework. I need to go online or go to the library. We've got the internet now where we can learn about various cultures and people. And you can participate in workshops instead of just asking that person that you know that comes from that culture. That person is then overly burdened in sharing. And those people generally often do have full-time jobs and families and all of the other responsibilities that anyone else does. And to heap on top of them the additional responsibility of educating others about their culture is unfair. They're human just like us. It's important that we all share the responsibility. So you've already begun learning about different tools, like asking questions, getting clarification, acknowledging, validating, recognizing the impact of comments and words on others, or using code words. You've already learned about all of these tools throughout the presentation. You've also learned about using compassion and how we can meet in the middle at certain times, and learned about the idea of being open-minded and open to understanding bias and oppression. You can do this. You can do your part, and you can do that by reflecting, by acknowledging the way that you communicate with people, and that requires doing your homework. Again, you're not a bad person for having those moments where you haven't behaved the way that now you realize you shouldn't have. When an issue happens, when a problem happens, view it as an opportunity to do better. All right, let's see. I made 3 pages of references that you can look through. You can use to learn more about microaggressions, about systems of power and privilege, about how to be a better ally, how to invest your time in the community and in a number of communities. Thank you. Yep, any questions? Chris is saying thank you, Dr. Moore, for sharing these tools and the situation. I really do appreciate that. And it is close to 3 o'clock, so we might have time for a single question if anyone would like to ask those questions. We have time for one question. And forgive me, I have 2 very small eyes, and I'm not able to keep an eye on the chat. I would love to read the comments afterwards. I guess I'm old-fashioned. Remember where I come from, even before I was born, before that technology was. When I look at my son and my grandchildren, it's amazing to see the technology that they use, and I have to work hard to keep up with them. So thank you for your patience.
Well, thank you. I think there was one question in the chat. talking about the Harvard Implicit Association Test. Is that free?
I'm sorry, could you repeat that question?
Yes. You referred to the implicit association test. Is that something that's free?
Oh, wonderful, wonderful news. Yes, I love the IATs and they are free. And there are several different types of tests under different topics. So you can select the topics that are most relevant to you. And they'll give you the results at the end as well. And yeah, they're very interesting assessments. And yes, they are free. Uh, Also, I would recommend that you think about having a group session where you ask participants to take the tests and then bring the results with them and have a dialogue around those. Maybe some people feel embarrassed by their results or feel like they want to hide their results, but doing that isn't going to help. Remember, all of us are human. And we already know, I mean, I'm not perfect. And when I took some of these bias tests, I didn't like my results, but it also motivated me to change and made me want to change and improve my perspective. And so I sat with my consultants and had a conversation about that. And it's healthy. It's healthy to have those conversations. I mean, look at how complicated the world is out there. I mean, again, people need to be able to understand themselves in order to be able to process things better, and they need to assess themselves and use tools like this to be able to understand themselves and others.
Appreciate that you bring that up and think about how our mindset can actually inhibit our personal growth. We want to be able to open up those filters and engage in these deeper conversations.
Mm-hmm.
I'm wondering if anyone would like to ask, a question live on video. If we don't have time, then we can have folks reach out to you to allow for a follow-up, I'm assuming.
Sure, sure. And if someone would like to have a private conversation, please feel free to reach out, schedule an appointment with me. I would be more than happy to have that conversation. Absolutely.
Great.
Mike, hi.
Hi, Mike here. Thank you for your wonderful presentation. My question has to do with music.
Mm-hmm.
Um, there are a lot of songs that have the N word, and there's a cultural difference as far as certain swear words that are used. There are times where I feel like it's not right, but I'm not a person of color. But I would like to address when students in school or in social settings are using some of the language from these songs. What do I do?
You raise a very good question because some people say, oh, well, this is considered culture and more of culture. But it's still unhealthy, especially for children who are receiving all of this to get negative messages or language and the belief that negative language is okay. And we all share responsibility in teaching about words that are positive and negative and the words that are unacceptable. So it may mean sitting down. So your students, if they are minors, may happen to come talk to you about things from their families, and you can talk to them about things that are okay and not okay to bring to school because of the negative impact that they could have on others. I would also want family educators to work with some of these families as well, to again take a level of responsibility. And right, that also ties into discipline. Discipline is a separate issue entirely. And it's not easy, but I would say that that's not an example of culture. That kind of language is not acceptable, especially in my community. parents do sit down with their children and talk to them about what music should be listened to. And if that music includes that negative language, won't allow it. So that can be about disciplining kids around what is acceptable and what is not acceptable. That's my answer to the question. Do you feel like I answered your question?
Yeah, I think the importance here is having that communication with their family. And I think there's times where I just feel awkward or unsure on how to proceed. So I appreciate your explanation and I understand.
Thanks, Mike.
Thank you for this workshop. You know, CESD is really grateful for you giving up your time to share your wisdom, knowledge, and expertise with those of us that work with, students, deaf students in the K through 12 and college arena. So thank you very much, Dr. Moore.
I appreciate it. Sure.